I never tire of that, do you? I never tire of remembering what Jesus did for us. And I hope and pray that you guys know that too. See, what am I supposed to do here, Jason? Just hit the space bar. I can do that. Anything beyond that, please, no. I want to thank you for the invitation to be here. I was here, when was the last time I was here? It was a few months ago. And I think about you guys a lot. I really do. You might think I'm just up here to say that. I don't. I really do. Thank you for the invitation to be here. It's good to get to know you. As I said before, that I'm going to go to heaven and spend eternity with you guys. And at least that's my intent. I hope that's your intent. I hope that one day when we can, as we've talked about in the song a while ago that Eli led us in, I'll fly away. You guys ever thought about that? Flying away? I mean, flapping your arms and but don't have to flap your arms, you just fly away like the Lord was ascending into heaven. So we will be caught up to meet the Lord in the air, and so shall we ever be with the Lord. I can't wait for that moment. It's just going to be something that I live for and I'm willing to die for, and I hope that you feel the same way. As we made mention of just a few moments ago in our Bible class about the life of the Apostle Paul, I hope that what I can do in this couple of lessons with you is just instill within you the desire to say, if he could do it, I can do it. And we might be thinking to ourselves, well, wait, time out. This man was some kind of super smart. And he was. He was a very intelligent man. He was well educated. He had a great upbringing in that regard. He was schooled as a son of a Pharisee. And if you know anything about Pharisees, by the age of 12, they had already memorized Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Memorized it, word for word. There were 613 laws in the Pharisaic tradition of the Old Testament. He had to be able to quote all 613 of them. There was 365 negatives and 248 positives, and he had to know them all, and he had to try to live obeying all of those. That's what a Pharisee did. He was the son of a Pharisee, and then he was also then sent at the age probably of 13, as most boys would have been. He was sent down to the city of Jerusalem to be schooled at the feet of a man. Do you remember his name? Gamaliel, who was the ultimate. Gamaliel was the son-in-law of Hillel, who was considered one of the greatest rabbis of all time. And so he sat at the feet of a very learned man. And Gamaliel will be seen a couple of times in the New Testament, in fact, even standing up for the Christians in one sense. And so I just want you to kind of see that Paul was no ignoramus, that Paul was a man of great learning, but also a man of great sin. And if God could call a man such as that and save a man such as that, and Paul could then turn and tell us, look, imitate me. What you are is just that. Imitate me as I imitate Christ. And I want you to make that kind of a goal. We all need our heroes. Who's your hero if you wanted to be a good mother? Who would you look to be a good mother? I mean, surely you know somebody out there in this world. Even if you're from a dysfunctional home, there's people out there that you can see, I'd like to be like her. You want to be a good dad. You want to be a good husband or a good wife. Or whatever your vocation might be, a carpenter or a plumber or a computer expert like me. If you wanted to be that, you look to those people and say, I'm going to kind of become a disciple of that person. The word disciple just simply means learner. Somebody who follows somebody and imitates them in every sense of the word. Jesus said, he told his apostles, follow me and imitate me. And Paul's now turning and saying the same thing to those behind him, like Timothy and Titus and Epaphroditus and others. And he says, imitate me. Now he's telling us the same thing. I might have a vocation in the sense of that's what I do, but a vocation to me is more than just what I do. It's what I am. It's who I am. And as a Christian, my vocation is a disciple of Jesus Christ. My citizenship is not on earth. Paul says to the Philippians, our citizenship is where? It's in heaven. That's who we are. We are heaven-bound people. And to do that, I want to be able to encourage people to look at the life of the Apostle Paul and say, look, become a follower of us. And I want you to think about it from that angle, that I have a responsibility to let my light shine, that others will see me and say, follow me. I'm an example to you. I want you to be an example. I want to be an example to you. And so God had a plan, and we finished our lesson a while ago with this passage in Galatians 1 and verse 15. When it pleased God, in other words, in God's own time, at God's right time, He separated me from my mother's womb and called me through His grace to reveal His Son in me. Think about that, to reveal His Son in me. You see me, you see Jesus. No, not the literal Jesus, but you see the imitation. I am so much like Jesus Christ in everything that I think, do, and say, that when others see me, they see a Christian. They see a follower of Christ, which is what Christian means, the one who takes on the name of Christ and imitates Him. And he says, and that I might preach Him among the Gentiles. God called me to be this man who would make this, we would call it a bridge. Now, he raised a Jew, but his preaching was mainly to who? To the Gentile people. He had to be a bridge. So God said, I need a man. I got to find somebody who's both able to connect to the Jews, but also to be able to connect to the Gentiles. Now, most Jews of the first century church would have been raised in and around Galilee and Judea and places like that. And they cut their teeth on going to synagogue and memorizing some of the scriptures and things like that. But they were fishermen, they were tax collectors, they were these different kinds of people. They were Jews, but they were Jews to the core. What God needed was a Jew who could preach to the Jews, but also he was raised in such a way in the city of Tarsus, Saul of Tarsus, which was very Gentile, very Roman. If you know anything about the city of Tarsus and do a study of the city of Tarsus, it was up in the Taurus Mountains, not Tarsus Mountains, but the Taurus Mountains, and it was not far from the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea, and Paul would be raised in a very Gentile setting, a very Roman setting. In fact, to be born in Tarsus automatically granted you what kind of citizenship? Roman citizenship. And he would use that in his ministry many times, that I am a Roman citizen, born free Roman. And so God was able to take a man like that and make a connection between the Jew and the Gentile world. And by the way, in the city of Tarsus, where he was from, the third greatest university in the Roman world was there, and he would have grown up and been schooled in that area around all these Gentiles. He knew the Roman world, he knew the Gentile world very, very well. And so he would be able to easily make that connection between them. It's very likely, being from there, he spoke not only Greek, which he certainly would have done, most people back then could, but he also would have spoke Latin. And who of course, was the Latin speakers? Rome, that was the official language of the Roman Empire, was Latin. And so you're going to see that. But what we just read a few moments ago, that we read in our reading a while ago, is in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. When Paul makes this statement, I want to show you this bridge, and there's a purpose. I'm leading you up to something. For though I am free from all men, I made myself a servant to all, that I might win the more. Keep looking at that word win. We'll see that again. Number one, to the Jews, I became as a Jew that I might win the Jews. He was a Jew by birth. To those who are under the law, as under the law, that I might win those who are under the law. That's still saying he's a Jew, but the idea that he could even work with proselytized Jews, Hellenists, as we might call them. Number three, to those who are without law, as without law, not being without law toward God, but law toward Christ, that I might win those who are without law. He's talking about those who don't have the Jewish law, the Roman law, the Mosaic law. That's the Gentiles. To the weak I became as weak, that I might win the weak. That means just the outcast, the sinners of the world, the forgotten. And he says, ultimately, I have become all things to all men that I might by all means save some. My goal, not just as an evangelist, I've been a preacher now for, starting this year, 50 years. 1974, I started preaching on a regular basis. Benita was actually with me. She was dating me, and she decided to stay with me in spite of those early sermons. You know, that shows you what kind of forbearance that woman has. But just the idea that's when I started full-time preaching in that respect. So I was in an intern program in 1974 and 75. And so for 50 years, I've been trying to figure out how to be a preacher. I'm still an amateur at it. But to become all things to all men was my life's mission, and it should be yours as well. That I want to ask you a question. If you spent your entire life, and all you did in your entire life, the only thing you could look back on and say for certain is that you impacted the life of one other person and they went to heaven. I'm going to ask you a question. Was that worth it to you? It might be your spouse. It might be a child. It might just be your neighbor. It just might be a friend or a sister or a brother. But if you have spent your whole life and saved just one more soul for eternity, your own and theirs, your life was worth the living. And God's telling us that our lives must make a difference in people's lives. That every one of us are leaders in that respect. At least we should be. The only really definition of a leader is turn around and look. Is anybody following you at all? Is anybody looking at you? Is anybody trying to imitate you? And I guarantee you somebody is. I guarantee you you're impacting the life of somebody. And if you can impact them for the spiritual cause of their salvation, you've lived your life well. I want you to think about it from that angle. I have made myself a servant to all, Paul said. Think about that statement. I made myself a servant to all. He's going to talk a lot in the scriptures about he's a free man. He's been set free by the life of Jesus Christ. I'm a free man. But then he turns right around after giving him this freedom from sin, and he turns right around and he says, put the shackles back on. But in this case, it's for others. He was broken from the shackles of Satan, and now he says, I'm shackled to Christ, and now I'm no longer a free man, I'm a servant to all. That's a powerful statement. He says, I become all things to all men, that what? That I might by all means save some. If I can just impact the life of people just a little bit. I want to ask you a question. Is this only for the apostles? Go back in chapter 10, verse 31. Therefore, whether you eat or drink or whatever you do all to the glory of God. Give no offense either to the Jews or the Greeks or the church of God, just as I also please all men in all things, not seeking my own profit, but for the profit of many, that they may be saved. He's telling them to do what he did, and here's what he did, that they may be saved, and then he says, hey, you, imitate me as I imitate Christ. He's called us not just as an apostle to imitate him as an apostle, but he says, imitate me so that others will imitate you. In 2 Timothy 2 and in verse 2, the things that I taught you, Timothy, you teach to faithful men who will be able to teach others also. That's 4 generations. Paul taught Timothy to teach others. And he's saying the same thing to us, that we have a responsibility to impact the lives of people. Paul's aim, and I want you to think about this. So as we read this, I'm going to throw up a couple of words in just a moment. Going back to that passage, though I'm free from all men, I've made myself a servant to all that I might what? Win the more. I want you to see this over and over again until you say, Rick, stop. To the Jews I became a Jew that I might win the Jews. To those who are under the law, as under the law, that I might win those who are under the law. To those without law, as without law, that I might win those who are without law. To the weak I became as weak that I might win the weak. I become all things to all men that I might by all means save some. Win, 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 win. I need to win a soul. I need to win souls if at all possible. What's your life's mission? I want you to throw it. Paul's aim was to go to heaven and to do what? Take as many as he could with him. How many of you think Paul got there? I mean, seriously, guys. How many do you think Paul got there? He went all over the world, spent the next 30-something years of his life If he was converted somewhere around 35, 36, and he died in 68, that gives you about 33 years. And that man did not have an idle bone in his body. He was always, from morning to evening, as he had done before his conversion, waking up to kill. Now he's waking up to win. His whole life's mission is to save another soul. I don't think that man could have pillowed his head at night without thinking, did I impact the life of one more soul today? To win souls, to win souls, to win souls. That's what he wanted to do, to win souls. And I've got to get in my mind that DNA that Paul had, to be able to always be thinking, wherever I am, whatever I'm doing today, if I'm going to Walmart, is there somebody at that cash register who's having a bad day that I can say something nice to them that everybody else is saying, hey, you overcharged me. But you can say, man, you have served me well. Thank you so much. To win their soul, to make an impact for good. In 1 Corinthians 9, verse 23, why should he surrender his freedom to become a slave to all? To win souls, and I want you to think of one more thing. Now, this I do for the gospel's sake. I want you to look at this word partaker, that I might be a partaker of it with you. You know what that is saying? He's saying, I want to do this to be a partaker. The word is koinonia. What's that word mean? Fellowship. I want to be a partaker with them. What he means by that is ultimately, I want you to go to heaven, and I want to be with you. I want to partake with you in that heavenly glory. But remember, Paul had made some statements in his life. Woe is unto me if I do not preach the gospel. He says the word woe there means I'm damned. I'll be damned if I don't preach the gospel as God. If I back off, he called me. I became a preacher, by the way, but God never called me. I could have gone to heaven and been a carpenter. Been a bad one. I could have been a computer expert. I mean, I could have done other things in my life and still gone to heaven. Paul couldn't. When God called him, he blinded him. He sent him to that room. He says, I'm going to send a man, and here's what his mission is. And you got to tell him his mission. What if Paul said, no, thank you? What if Paul said, no, I don't want to do that. I don't think I can. Gentiles, no, I'm going to get a ticket and go to Tarshish. I'm not going to do that. God said, you're going to hell then. I'm calling you to this mission. I didn't receive a call like that. I didn't get a call. He didn't come down and say, Rick, if you don't start preaching, you're going to go to hell. No, he didn't tell me that. I chose to do this. But Paul would have gone to hell for not preaching. And Paul is basically saying, if I don't seek and save these lost people, if my job is not to go out and preach to the Gentiles and save them like these Corinthians, then I can't be a partaker with you. And he's talking about ultimately heaven, about being saved with them. Now, these people were pretty despicable people in Corinth. They did a lot of bad things. And they were always divisive. They were always arguing among themselves. They were even taking a man's wife and sleeping with her. They were doing a lot of things they shouldn't have been doing. And Paul was trying to correct them for that. But he was saying, ultimately, I'm doing that to save your soul, so that by your soul being saved, I want to join you. But if I don't preach and teach you, then I'm not going to be able to join you. And that's kind of what he's saying is, take heed to yourselves and to the doctrine. Why? Continue in them, for in doing this you'll both save yourself, he tells Timothy the preacher, and those who hear you. One of the reasons I became a preacher, God didn't give me a call to do this, but maybe he gave me some talents to do this, and I had to look and to see what kind of talents does God give me, 1, 2, or 5 talents. Whatever my talents were, I wanted to use them for God's glory. But I realized that if I become a preacher, I spend my life studying the Bible and going out and teaching people and trying to convert people. That gives me a pretty good modus operandi. It gives me a good mission of my life is always waking up and what's the first thing that's got to come into my mind? What am I doing as an evangelist? What's the word evangelist? The carrier of good news, a bearer of glad tidings. My job is to tell the world there's good news. Jesus saves. But you save yourself and those who hear you. I love the passage in 1 Corinthians 9. I discipline my body and bring it into subjection lest after I've preached to others, I myself should be disqualified. I can preach to you and save your soul but by the message, God's grace, but I could lose my soul if I don't practice what I preach, right? And Paul's saying the same thing. I want to be a partaker. He's saying to the Corinthians, I'm not just telling you something. I've got to tell it and live it. I got to practice what I preach. And if you are saved, I want to be saved with you. And by my preaching and teaching you, then together we can be partakers. We can fellowship each other in that heavenly home. But my question is going to be, what are we saved, when he says I'm going to win the more, what are we saved from? You know, there's the idea of a passive concept of saving. I used to watch my mom and dad and others play some cards with some friends, and they talk about saving a hand. I don't even know what that means. But to save a hand, they win the hand is what they would do. Or at a ball game, I know what that's talking about, being brought in, the guy who hits a home run or pitches great, he saves the game. Or maybe save you from embarrassment. We're not talking about those kind of salvation. We're talking about, obviously, a spiritual connotation. Like when God told Noah to build an ark, and for what reason? What does the Bible say? The saving of his house. What if Noah hadn't built that ark? They'd all drowned. So he saved his family, and so there was something urgent about what he was doing. And so the same thing is involved here as I look at 1 Thessalonians 1, verse 10. And to wait for his Son from heaven, whom he raised from the dead, even Jesus, who delivers us from what? The wrath to come. When I'm trying to teach you to become a Christian, to obey the gospel, I'm trying to get you to understand there's wrath coming. God's wrath. It's a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God, an angry God. The wrath of God is coming. We don't sidestep that. We don't try to water that down and put it and sweep it under the rug and just talk about the grace of God and the love of God. No, wrath is coming. The wrath against those who do not obey the gospel of Jesus Christ. 2 Thessalonians 1, verse 7, that's what he's going to say. There's going to be wrath of God. And so my job is, the good news is, that wrath can be appeased. There's a propitiation, which means the appeasing of the wrath of God. Jesus is the propitiation for our sins. He is the appeaser of God's wrath. And that's good news. And I want to tell you that you can have, I'm going to save you from the wrath. And I want you to be a partaker, a fellowshipper with me, as he says, in the gospel and in your salvation. I want to go to heaven with you. So one of the things my job is, and your job is as Christians, is to tell people, let's go to heaven together. Let's partake, let's have fellowship, not only in this life and what we're doing right here, right now, but imagine singing the praises of God for eternity together. I am resolved no longer to linger. Eli's going to lead us in a few moments. I'm resolved no longer to linger, charmed by the world's delights. I have a home in heaven. When all of God's singers get home, that's what we're in this for. John 3, verse 36, he who believes in the Son has everlasting life. That's what we partake in. Eternal life. Everlasting life. We're going to have that fellowship forever and ever. And here's the strategy, two things that Paul has. As I'm understanding, as I've been studying the life of Paul, I try to come up with, what's your strategy, Paul? How do you do this? How do you become all things to all men, that you might by all means save just even a few, even some? I got to know his strategy so I can use my strategy the same. If I'm going to save some in my lifetime, I got to have a strategy to this. I can't just arbitrarily wake up and just fall out of bed and think I'm going to save somebody. I've got to have a strategy to this, like you do anything else you want to be successful with. Well, what is that? Though I am free from all men, I have become a what? Look at that word. What does that mean? A servant, a slave. The word is the word doulos, which means a bondservant. I am a bondservant to all. I've become free from all, but here's what it is. I have become all things to all men. It's love. And that's what he's saying here. Owe no man anything except to love one another. He who loves another has fulfilled the law. Love does no harm to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law. That's what we call kind of the royal law. The wonderful law of love is that I owe no man anything except to love you. If I really believe that, Karen, if I really say I love you, I'm going to do what's best for your soul. Now, what if you're sinning? I rebuke you. Why? Because I want to save you. It's like we do a child. We have to correct a child. If we want that child to be better, you got to correct him when he's doing something wrong. Notice I said he, because the girls never do anything wrong. But love is the strategy. And if I can, my dad taught all 5 of us kids, there was this book that was put out by a guy, and it was talking about the scrolls, the 10 scrolls, and he had one, and my mom still has it as a plaque on the wall there at our house. I will greet this day with love in my heart. And Dad always taught us to say this. Whenever you go up and shake somebody's hand, here's what you automatically do. You don't have to say it out loud, but you're thinking, I love you. Now, what is that going to do? That's going to change the dynamic of whatever you're about to say to this person, or however you're going to react toward them. And when you say love, you're using the word agape. I'm going to agape you. Some people think, well, that means you eat them or what? I agape them. It means I love them like God loves them. God loved them unconditionally. God so loved the world. He agape the world. He loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son. And so whenever I meet you, whenever I said, shake John's hand, hey brother, my thought is, I love you. You gotta be careful saying that to somebody out loud, but just the idea of this, I love you is, I love you. And that means whatever else I'm about to say or do in my relationship with you is, I'm going to do whatever it takes to help you to go to heaven. That's the goal of it. That was Paul's strategy. He never met a person he didn't love. And he would do anything he could to save their soul. And here's the second point, and that's balance. And this is the hard one, guys. This is the real hard one. This is Paul's strategy, though. When he says, I've done all things to save some, he was saying it in this way. A passage in 1 Corinthians 10, talking about eating of meats offered to idols. And that was just one great illustration of Paul, of how he dealt with people. If any of those who do not believe invite you to dinner and you desire to go, eat whatever is set before you, asking no questions for conscience sake. Believe me, brothers, you go to China, you got to say that, you got to quote that a lot. You're going to eat whatever's put before you, asking no questions, because you don't know what you're eating. You know, it's probably Fido. But if anyone says to you, this was offered to idols, do not eat it for the sake of one who told you, and for conscience sake, but for the earth is the Lord's and all. In other words, God says you can eat it, so you go ahead and eat it. You might not like it, but you can eat it. Eat it for their sake. Why? Conscience, I say, not your own, but that of the other. You're doing it to make an influence and an impact in somebody else's life. When in Rome, you do what Rome does, as the old saying goes. In other words, I've got to be, as Jesus would say, you've got to be in the world, but not of the world. And that's what he was praying in John 17. Lord, I've kept them out of the world, but they're still in the world, because he turned around and he said in the Great Commission to go into all the world. You got to be in the world, but you can't be like the world. There's a difference. And so I got an illustration there of kind of walking a tightrope. That's really what you're doing. On one side of the tightrope, you could fall toward the world and be like the world. Well, you're not going to impact anybody that way if you're living sinful, worldly ways. Or to flip on the other side, you can be an ascetic, a stoic, a hermit, and get out of the world and never have any influence at all with anybody in the world. You can go that direction, but God says you got to kind of walk a fine line. I got to be in this world, but I can't be like the world. I've got to influence the world to Jesus Christ. That's why he said in 1 Corinthians 5, verses 9 through 11, that then he said, I'm not telling you you can't, he's talking about a brother that he's been withdrawn from and disciplined. And he says, I'm not saying you can't have anything to do with fornicators of the world, because you got to get in the world to influence them into Christ. He says, but that particular brother, you got to treat him as if he's now lost. I've delivered him over to Satan that his soul might be saved in the day of judgment. That's what he said about that guy. And so my whole mission is, I got to always be thinking of heaven, but I got to live in the world, and I got to impact the world. And so to do that, I've got to mix and mingle with the world, but not to let them influence me to influence them. That's a balance. That's a balancing act. It's harder than anything Houdini would have ever done. So I want to spend just a moment, go quickly through this. We don't have time to spend a lot of time here. When he says, I became a Jew, think about what was his occupation? What did he grow up doing? Every Jewish boy had to learn a trade. His was being a tent maker. Some translations say the word leather worker there. He had an elite Jewish heritage. I've already talked about this. He was circumcised the 8th day. He's stock of Israel, the tribe of Benjamin. He was probably named after Saul, King Saul, because Saul was from Benjamin, and he was from Benjamin. So he was probably named after King Saul. And he was a Hebrew of Hebrews, which meant he spoke the Hebrew language. when the Jews came out of exile, those 400 years from Malachi to Matthew, when we had those 400 silent years, during that period of time when the Maccabean revolt took place and all of that, there arose these people called, there was 4 different sects that you never found these groups in the Old Testament. You only found them, they grew up during these 400 years of silence after the exile. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, and the Zealots. Which one did Paul become? He became a Pharisee, which was the most religious of the bunch, obviously. And so he had a great heritage in that regard. He says, I became a Pharisee. Malachi, actually the Pharisees used Malachi chapter 3 for their modus of doing things. When they talked about for those who fear the Lord, who meditate on His name, they memorized the Scriptures. They knew all the law. They knew all these things. They could quote verbatim the Scriptures of the Old Testament. They memorized all the rules and regulations, the Mishnah, which is the commentaries of them. He became a Pharisee. He became a Pharisee, so when he says, I could win the Jews because I knew Judaism back like the back of my hand. I was a Jew in every sense of the word. I grew up a Jew. I grew up a Pharisee. I knew the law. I knew all the commentaries of the law. I could quote all this stuff. He says, I had all that down. In fact, I was a valedictorian. That's kind of what he said. When he said, I advanced in Judaism beyond all my peers, basically. If you were giving graduation, he probably would have been a salutatorian or maybe even the valedictorian. He was the best of the best. And God saw that in this man. This man got up in the mornings and he was driven to become the best that he could be. He graduated, summa cum laude, at Hebrew University there in Jerusalem. He spoke the Hebrew tongue. I won't go into all the details here. He knew all the Jewish customs. He's kept the law from his youth up, even taking Timothy and having him circumcised. Titus, he refused to do that because he became a Gentile to the Gentile. I wanted to get that point across. He became a Jew to the Jew. In other words, he knew how to talk Jewish ways. He knew how to look at all the customs, all those different things. He knew that. But then, to those that were without law, and that is the idea of a Gentile, he says, I had to know how the Gentiles think. I mean, when we live in a land that has all kinds of the America's melting pot, we have a melting pot here. I'd love for you to come up and visit us at Northwest. We have large numbers of Africans now with us. We have people from India coming. We're studying with them. We have people from South America, Central America. We just now got a big number of families in the last 2 weeks from Ecuador. There's like 9 or 10 of them. And they became members with us. You have blacks, you have whites, you have Hispanics, you have all kinds, red and yellow, black and white. They are precious in His sight. We have all of those there. And so I've got Bible studies going with a lot of them. And so I don't like eating like they eat necessarily, but you do that. They invite us over. We get invited over on Monday nights to eat the Hindu foods. And these are Hindi people, the Hindu people, Hinduism. These couple of them worship many gods. And we're trying to teach them there's one God. And so what do? Do you reject everything they put in front of you? No, you eat asking no questions for conscience sake. I don't know what I'm putting down my mouth, but I'm going to eat it anyway because I want to impact her. I want to lead her to Jesus Christ. To the Gentiles, that's what Paul had to do. He grew up repulsed by Gentilism. He grew up in that midst in Tarsus, but he says, I understand how they work. I understand the rules and regulations of how Gentiles. God says, I need that. I need you to bridge the gap. You can speak it. I gave you a Roman passport at your birth, and I want you to use it to go into all the world and to preach the gospel to all the Gentiles. And so here he is. He said, I was born a citizen. He could speak their language. In fact, the Roman centurion says, you speak Greek? I do. Most of the Jews would speak Aramaic. They wouldn't speak the Greek language. But Paul could speak Greek because he grew up in the Greek world. And so he could speak that, and he could speak Hebrew. He knew all of their customs. To some, he would circumcise because they were going to be in the Jewish community, like Timothy. Titus, he would say, nope, not even for an hour will I let this man be circumcised, because he's a Gentile through and through. His mom and his dad are. And I'm not going to use him. I'm going to use him as an example that you don't have to be circumcised to be saved. And so he understood how the Gentiles thought. He understood how the Jews thought. Is where his education, I said a while ago, he was in a city that had world education. Alexandria was the greatest university in the world. Athens was the second greatest university in the world, and Tarsus was the third greatest university in the Roman world. Paul grew up among many of those. In fact, if you in Titus 1, in Acts 17, and in 1 Corinthians 15, he quoted from three different, we even know their quotes, you can look them up. Epimenides, Erastus, and Menander. He quoted from all three of those guys throughout some of his writings. You know, when he stood there in Athens in Acts chapter 17, he sat there and quoted from Erastus. Aratus is his name. He quoted from him, and so they would have been impressed by that. This Jew is sitting here preaching from Aratus and giving us Menander's quotes and so forth. He became a Gentile to a Gentile for the Gentile world to lead them to Jesus Christ. He didn't just come and say, you guys are a bunch of idolaters and you're going to go to hell. It's not what he said. He used their unknown God, and he used that as a launching point to bring them to Jesus Christ. And he probably converted many in Athens because of that. In other words, he's a man who's got a thought to himself. The Jews and the Gentiles, they have this problem. Here's this Gentile that's just come into the Christian faith, and he has a real problem because he's grown up going to these gods, and he knows what those meats being offered to idols up in the Areopagus there at Athens, or in the Parthenon there in Corinth. They just came out of this world, and the meats that are now being sold in the marketplaces, we know where that meat came from. They would offer them up there and then bring them down here and sell them. And so that was offered to an idol. I can't eat that stuff. It goes against my conscience. And the Jews sitting there saying, we can eat that. It's no big deal. The God's nothing. But the Gentiles sitting there after his conversion saying, I can't eat that. That's my old world. That's my old religion. And Paul says, I won't eat meat as long as the world stands if it causes my brother to stumble. I'll do anything and everything I can. I've become a slave to this man in that sense. I'm free to eat that meat, but I refuse to do it if it's going to cause my brother to stumble. Paul says, I give up my liberties in order to save a soul. That soul is of more value than all the food that I could ever eat in my lifetime. I'll give up hamburgers. I'll give up Fritos. I'll give up chocolate. I'll even give up coffee. I'll gladly give up coffee. I don't drink it. But when we look at all of this, we try to read the room and say, what can I do to impact this person's life? To the weak I became as weak. Here's talking about people who were in the Jewish world in Acts 21. We have 4 men who've taken a vow, and they said, Paul, look, they're all saying that you don't believe in Judaism anymore. And Paul was still a Jew. He was still practicing some of the Jewish things. That was but he wouldn't use that as a saying you got to keep this to go to heaven. He says, but I'm a Jew and I can practice Jewish customs. I can shave my head. I can take a vow. I can do these things. And he did that. But he turns right around and to the Gentiles, he says, but concerning the Gentiles who believe it, we have written and decided that they should do no such thing, and don't drink blood and things like that. He says, to the weak I became as weak that I might win the weak. It doesn't mean he became a sinner, but it means he gave in to the things that he could give into in order to make a difference in their life so they'll listen to him. We finish up by looking at this thing, becoming all things to all men. Paul's been sent out in Romans 1 in verses 5 and then verse 14 and 16. Through him we receive the grace and apostleship for obedience to the faith among all the nations for his name. And then he goes on to say, I become a debtor to all men, to the Jews, to the Gentiles. Why? Because the gospel is God's power unto salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. The gospel is for all. Did we sing that song? The gospel is for all. God's plan was, as we read a while ago from Galatians 1 verse 15, from my mother's womb he built me, he brought me into this world, and God could look down and he could see, I'm looking for a man that I can use to convert these people over here. He looks like a good candidate. He offered Paul the job, and Paul took it. And Paul sacrificed the rest of his life, gave up all of his freedoms that he had. He was a rising star in Judaism. He could have been among the elite. He could have been a Sanhedrin. He would have been Rabbi Saul, just like Rabbi Gamaliel. He would have been one of the great ones of all time, probably. He gave all of that up to save a soul, to save other wretches like him. And I'd like to think as though we look at our own lives, isn't that what we do? In Romans 12, there's a great passage, but I want to first start with John 13, then we'll close our lesson. A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another. My strategy is to love you so much that I'll give up in everything that I have to save your soul. And Paul and Jesus said, everybody will see that's your strategy. And then I start looking at it and I say, what can God use me with? I tell everybody who's ever converted, I say, I like to sit down with them. I said, what's your gift? What has God given you that you can use to save a soul? What can God do to use you in this church? And most people say, if I would say you're a 5-talent man, or are you a 3-talent man, or 2-talent man, or 1-talent man, you know what most people tell you? I'm a 0-talent man. And they look at their lives like that. Or they might say, well, if you're going to give me a choice, I'll be the one guy. I only have one talent. Well, if you read that story, you don't want to be the one guy. You look at your life and you say, God's gifted me with something. And I always tell people, here's what we're going to do. You're a brand new Christian. You don't think you have any talents. We're going to sit down and read Romans 12. And I'm going to find at least 3 talents in here that everybody has. Everybody has at least 3. There's 21 talents in Romans chapter 12, by the way. And you have at least 3 of them. I know. I can prove that. Let's look at them. You're going to give your body a living sacrifice that you may prove it. So he goes on and starts telling you. Having gifts differing, and he starts talking about things that they're gifts. There's prophecy. That means somebody who can preach. Prophecy was public preaching. Some, if you do that, then prophesy in proportion to your faith. How about ministering? That means serving. Can you serve? Hello? You can serve. How about who teaches? Well, some people say, I don't have any gift to teach. Okay, well, maybe that might not be one, but if it is one, what should you do with it? Teach. What about exhorting? Can you say, you're doing good, man, thumbs up? Can you do that? Can you tell the cash register lady at Walmart, good job? Exhort. There's more to exhortation just than that. How about giving? Some people can make money. I'm not one of them, but some of you can make money. If so, give it liberally to God. How about leading? Can you do that? Can you influence somebody's life? Can you show mercy? Everybody can show mercy. 7 times in a day, I'll forgive a man if he asks me for forgiveness. Let love be without hypocrisy. Abhor what is evil. Cling to what is good. Be kindly affectionate to one another with brotherly love. In honor, giving preference to one another. I can do that. I'm not going to lag in diligence. I'm going to be fervent in my spirit. I'm going to serve the Lord. I'm going to rejoice in hope. Look at all the words they're active words. They're words that you can be doing these things. Patient in tribulation. Steadfast in my prayers. Just given to hospitality. It means addicted to hospitality. Blessing those who persecute me, blessing and not cursing, rejoicing with those who rejoice, weeping with those who weep, being of the same mind toward one another. Do not set your mind on high things, associate with the humble. I can show you in there numbers of things that you can do. And God's saying in Romans chapter 12, here's a new Christian, and here's something you need to think about. Here's how you can make a difference in people's lives. He finishes up by talking about a few other things, and I love the best one is in verse 23. If it is possible, as much as depends on you, live peaceably with all men. Isn't that what Paul did? To the Gentiles, he did that. He lived peaceably with them. He could have argued with them till the cows came home and been right. But that's not what he wanted to do. He not to win an argument, he wanted to win a soul. And that was Paul's whole life. I close with this thought. Here's some things that I just get to thinking about. Here's some things that I can do. I can listen. Be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. I can be quick to listen to people. Listen, hear their story. Know the background of them. Don't jump to conclusions. That's the only exercise a lot of people get, just jumping to conclusions. Be peaceable. As much as in you is, live peaceably with all men. Practice the royal law. Show no partiality to anyone. Adapt. Walk in a person's shoes. Get to know them, whether they're from China or India, or we got a couple of Russians in our congregation. You got to learn to understand how they think and things, the Africans. No matter what color skin you have or what your gender status is or your age or any of those things, learn to adapt. An old man can adapt to a young person's world. And a young person can adapt to an old man's world. And we need to learn to do that to save souls. And I just want to say the royal law of love is, your strategy is to love others and save their souls. We'll stop there. There's a lot I could have said. I had to go pretty quickly here, and I apologize for that. But I wanted you to think about what you could be doing right now to save a soul. I hope that I've just ingrained within you something there, just motivated you to think of something that you can do to say, I can do that. I can be used by God. Maybe God has called me to influence this person's life. I want to ask you, how many people do you have on your prospect list? How many people have you written down and have on? And what I mean by that, you got to have a name that goes into your prayer life. Every day you're praying for that person, that God would open a door for their salvation and that He will use you to influence them to that end. Become all things to all men, that you might by all means save one. Thank you for your time. I am resolved no longer to linger, charmed by the world's delight. We're going to sing that song now. And if you need to be resolved, make a resolution. I know it's not January 1st, but you can still make a resolution that you've resolved to become a Christian even this morning. While together we stand, while we sing. 325.